What if the people around you are never quite who they appear to be? And what if your inability to see past the surface of human behavior has already cost you relationships, opportunities, and influence that you will never fully account for? Most people move through their lives reading others through the lens of their own assumptions, projecting their values onto people whose motivations are fundamentally different, and then feeling blindsided when reality turns out to be far more complex than the story they had constructed. Robert Greene wrote The Laws of Human Nature to give you the tools to see people as they actually are. Robert Greene spent years studying the patterns of human behavior across history, psychology, biography, and his own direct observation of power, ambition, and human nature in every form. His previous books, including The 48 Laws of Power and Mastery, established him as one of the most unflinching and most precise analysts of human behavior in modern literature. With The Laws of Human Nature, he produced his most comprehensive work, a deep and systematic examination of the invisible forces that drive human behavior, from the rationalization of irrational decisions to the unconscious envy that quietly poisons the people closest to us. By the time this analysis ends, you will understand why people rarely act from the motives they claim, how to read the emotional undercurrents beneath what people say and do, how to protect yourself from the most dangerous human types, and how to cultivate the self-awareness that transforms you from a reactive creature of impulse into a genuinely self-directed human being. Subscribe to the Book Vault right now, hit the like button, and share this with someone serious about understanding human nature at the deepest level. We are building toward 100 subscribers, and every share strengthens this community. The Strategic Breakdown: Master Your Emotional Self. We begin at the foundation of everything Greene builds in this book, with the law he places first, because without it, nothing else is possible, and he calls it Master Your Emotional Self. Greene opens with a deceptively simple observation. At any given moment, the part of your brain that processes emotion is working faster, more powerfully, and more persistently than the part that reasons. This is not a character flaw. It is the biological architecture of the human mind. The emotional brain evolved millions of years before the rational one, and under pressure, uncertainty, or threat, it consistently overrides the slower, more deliberate, rational processes we rely on to make good decisions. Greene introduces what he calls the rational lover, his term for the person who has learned to recognize the onset of emotional hijacking and create the space to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. He uses the example of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman who developed an almost preternatural ability to remain calm and deliberate during the most intense political and military crises of his era. When his opponents expected rage, he offered measured analysis. When crowds were swept into panic, he stepped back and waited. That capacity for emotional distance, Greene argues, is not a personality trait that some people simply have. It is a discipline that any person can develop with sufficient self-knowledge and practice. The practical tool Greene provides for developing this capacity is what he calls the sublime detachment, the cultivated habit of observing your own emotional states with the same curious neutrality you would bring to watching a documentary about someone else. When you feel anger, jealousy, anxiety, or the urge to react, you learn to pause and name the emotion precisely, to ask what triggered it and what it is trying to protect, before deciding how or whether to act on it. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means developing the relationship with your own inner life that makes you the author of your responses rather than their victim. See through the self-delusions of others. The chapter that follows introduces one of the most psychologically rich laws in the entire book, and Greene frames it around a truth that most people find deeply uncomfortable. Every human being is a rationalizing creature before they are a rational one. We make decisions based on emotion, self-interest, desire, and the need to protect our self-image, and then we construct logical narratives to justify those decisions after the fact. This process happens so quickly and so automatically that we genuinely believe our own rationalizations, and because we believe them, we present them to the world as objective reasoning, which is how intelligent people end up defending positions that serve their interests while genuinely believing they are motivated by principle. Greene uses the example of John C. Calhoun, the 19th century American senator who constructed an elaborate intellectual defense of slavery built on arguments about states' rights, economic necessity, and social order. Calhoun was a brilliant man. His arguments were sophisticated, and they were entirely in service of a self-interest so deeply embedded that he could no longer separate it from his convictions. Greene uses this not to make a moral point, but to illustrate a cognitive one. The more intelligent a person is, the more sophisticated the rationalizations they construct, and the harder those rationalizations are to see through, in others and in yourself. The discipline this law installs is a specific kind of skepticism directed at your own reasoning. Whenever you find yourself constructing an elaborate justification for a decision that happens to serve your interest, Greene suggests you treat that justification as a signal rather than a conclusion. Ask what emotion or self-interest might be driving this reasoning. What would you think of this decision if someone else were making it and explaining it the same way? That question, applied honestly and regularly, begins to close the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are, which is the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. Understand people's darkest sides. Now we arrive at one of the most important and most uncomfortable chapters in the entire book. The chapter where Greene examines the law he calls Understand People's Darkest Sides, specifically the law of covetousness and envy. Greene argues that envy is the most universal and the most carefully concealed of all human emotions. Every person who has ever experienced the success of someone they consider their equal or their peer has felt it. The discomfort of watching someone else get what you want is not a sign of a deficient character. It is a deeply human response rooted in our social nature and our need for relative status. What matters is what you do with it. The danger Greene documents is not the envy itself, but its disguises. Envy almost never announces itself as envy. It arrives dressed as criticism, as concern, as objective analysis, as friendly advice. The colleague who consistently finds fault with your work after you receive a promotion is not offering balanced assessment. The friend who points out every potential problem with your exciting new plan is not simply being realistic. Greene teaches readers to look for the pattern beneath the behavior, to notice when criticism is curiously concentrated in the areas where you are succeeding, and to recognize that pattern as the signature of unacknowledged envy rather than genuine concern. The strategic application of this law cuts in two directions. Toward others, it teaches vigilance, the ability to identify the people in your circle whose relationship with your success is fundamentally competitive rather than genuinely supportive. Toward yourself, it teaches honesty, the willingness to acknowledge your own envy when it arises rather than disguising it as something more respectable. Greene argues that the person who can look at their own envy clearly, who can say, "I want what this person has, and that wanting makes me uncomfortable," has access to information about their own desires that the person who suppresses or disguises envy never receives. Your envy, examined honestly, is a map of what you actually want. Know your limits. The chapter Greene builds around the law of grandiosity is one of the most strategically important in the entire book for anyone who has experienced early success because it addresses the precise moment when the qualities that produce success begin to produce failure. Greene calls it Know Your Limits, and the historical example he uses to anchor it is one of the most instructive in modern history. Michael Eisner, the CEO who transformed Disney into one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the world through the 1980s and 90s, became so certain of his own judgment following his extraordinary success that he stopped listening to the advisors, the creative partners, and the market signals that had made his success possible. The confidence that had been his greatest asset became his most dangerous liability. Greene traces the psychological mechanism behind this pattern with unusual precision. Success creates a subtle but persistent shift in the brain's threat assessment. When things have been going well for a long time, the mind begins to attribute outcomes to personal genius rather than to the complex combination of skill, timing, circumstance, and collaboration that success almost always requires. This attribution error produces overconfidence, which produces the kind of decisions that look brilliant to someone who believes they cannot be wrong and catastrophic to everyone watching from the outside. Greene calls this the law of grandiosity, and he documents it across military leaders, business executives, and artists with equal consistency. The antidote Greene prescribes is the deliberate cultivation of what he calls forced humility, the practice of regularly seeking out information and perspectives that challenge your current view of a situation, rather than seeking the confirmation that success makes so easy to find. The person who has been right for a long time must work harder than anyone else to stay genuinely open to the possibility that they are wrong, because the emotional reward of certainty becomes more seductive the more time certainty has proven justified. Knowing your limits is not about lowering your ambitions. It is about protecting your judgment from the very success that most threatens to corrupt it. Seize the historical moment. The chapter Greene titles around what he calls the Law of Generational Myopia introduces one of his most distinctive and most intellectually stimulating ideas, the argument that understanding the historical forces shaping your particular moment in time is one of the most powerful forms of self-knowledge available. Greene argues that every generation is shaped by the specific historical circumstances of its formative years in ways so deep and so pervasive that most people never become conscious of them. The values, fears, assumptions, and blind spots that feel like personal convictions are often simply the psychological residue of the era you grew up in. The strategic implication of this law is immediate and profound. The person who can step back from their own generational perspective and see it as one limited vantage point among many gains a form of situational intelligence that most people never develop. They can identify the historical forces creating the opportunities of the current moment. They can see the assumptions of their generation that are about to become obsolete, and they can position themselves to be ahead of the cultural and economic shifts that others will only recognize in retrospect. Greene uses historical figures from every era to show that the people who most successfully seized their historical moment were almost always the people who had developed the ability to see their moment from the outside. Confront your mortality. The final chapter of the strategic breakdown arrives at the most philosophically profound law in the entire book, and Greene approaches it with an honesty that is rare even in serious literature. He calls it Confront Your Mortality, and he argues that the relationship each person has with the fact of their own death is one of the most powerful and most underexamined forces shaping their behavior, their choices, and the quality of their life. Most people manage their awareness of mortality through denial, through distraction, through the construction of legacies and belief systems that promise some form of continuity beyond the physical self. Greene is not interested in the comfort those strategies provide. He is interested in what they cost. Greene uses the example of Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher who, after nearly dying from a riding accident, emerged with a transformed relationship to time, to priority, and to the quality of his daily experience. Montaigne began writing his famous essays, not as an intellectual project, but as an act of radical self-examination driven by his confrontation with his own mortality. The work he produced became some of the most enduring writing in the Western canon, precisely because it was written by someone who had stopped pretending that time was unlimited. The awareness of mortality, Greene argues, is not a source of despair for the person who genuinely confronts it. It is the most powerful clarifying force available to a human life. Key lessons and insights. Your emotions are running the show, whether you know it or not. The first lesson this book teaches, and the one that makes every other law possible to apply, is that emotional awareness is not a soft skill. It is the foundational cognitive discipline that separates people who respond thoughtfully from people who react automatically. Greene shows through history and psychology that the most consequential decisions any person makes are almost always made under emotional influence that they are not fully conscious of. The person who develops the habit of recognizing their emotional state before acting on it gains a form of behavioral control that most people spend their entire lives without ever developing. Practice the discipline of emotional labeling this week in any high-stakes situation you encounter. When you feel a strong impulse to respond, pause for 10 seconds and name the emotion underneath the impulse as precisely as you can. Not just I am angry, but I am feeling threatened because this challenges something I need to be true. That precision does not eliminate the emotion. It gives you enough distance from it to choose your response rather than simply executing it. Over time, that pause becomes automatic, and the quality of your decisions under pressure improves in ways that compound across every area of your life. Rationalization is the most dangerous form of self-deception. The second lesson Greene delivers with historical depth and psychological precision is that the most intelligent people are also the most skilled rationalizers, which makes them the most vulnerable to a specific and particularly dangerous form of self-deception. The ability to construct sophisticated justifications for decisions driven by self-interest is not a sign of intellectual weakness. It is a sign of intellectual power applied in the wrong direction. The discipline this lesson demands is a specific form of intellectual honesty, the habit of asking not whether your reasoning is logically coherent, but whether it is actually true. Apply this lesson by developing what Greene calls the reality check habit. Before committing to any significant decision, ask yourself honestly what you would think of this decision if someone else were making it for identical reasons. That question removes you from the center of your own justification and allows you to see the decision more clearly. If your honest answer is that you would be skeptical of someone else making this choice for these reasons, that skepticism is worth examining before you proceed rather than after. Envy is information about what you actually want. The third lesson embedded throughout this book is the one that most directly challenges the cultural instinct to treat envy as purely a moral failing to be suppressed, rather than as a psychological signal to be examined. Greene argues that envy, honestly acknowledged and carefully examined, contains some of the most precise information available about what a person genuinely desires but has not yet admitted to themselves. The person who suppresses their envy loses that information. The person who examines it gains a map of their own authentic desires that no amount of deliberate self-reflection would otherwise produce. The practice this lesson installs is the discipline of honest envy audit. When you notice feelings of resentment or discomfort at someone else's success, resist the instinct to either suppress the feeling or disguise it as criticism. Instead, ask a direct question. What specifically do they have that I want? What does the intensity of this feeling tell me about how much I actually want it? And what has been stopping me from pursuing it directly? Those questions transform an uncomfortable emotion into actionable intelligence about the direction your life most wants to move. Success without self-knowledge produces grandiosity. The fourth lesson Greene builds across multiple chapters is the warning that every ambitious person most needs to hear at the moment they least want to hear it, which is precisely the moment of their greatest success. Success without continuous self-examination produces the attribution error that makes genuinely intelligent people make genuinely catastrophic decisions. When you have been right enough times, the brain begins to mistake the pattern of past success for a guarantee of future judgment. The leader who stops questioning their own certainty has begun the descent that their most spectacular eventual failure will make obvious only in retrospect. The discipline this lesson demands is the deliberate cultivation of intellectual humility as a daily practice, rather than as an occasional virtue. Seek out one person each week whose perspective genuinely challenges your current view of a situation you feel most certain about. Not to be argued out of your position, but to ensure your certainty is built on genuine understanding rather than on the accumulated comfort of having been right before. The leader who maintains this practice after success is the one whose success has a chance of lasting. Confronting mortality clarifies everything that matters. The fifth and final lesson this book builds toward is the most personally demanding and the most potentially transformative. Greene argues that the quality of a human life is directly related to the clarity a person has about its finite nature, and that most people live at a significant remove from that clarity, which produces a chronic diffusion of focus, a tendency to defer the things that matter most, and a kind of low-level existential anxiety that no amount of distraction ever fully resolves. The person who genuinely confronts their mortality, not as a morbid exercise but as a clarifying practice, begins to make choices with a quality of intention that the person who avoids that confrontation simply cannot access. The action this lesson calls for is a specific weekly reflection practice. Set aside 10 minutes each week to ask yourself one question with genuine seriousness. If I had 1 year left, what would I stop doing and what would I start doing immediately? You do not need to act on the answer dramatically or immediately, but write it down, return to it, let it sit alongside your daily decisions as a quiet but persistent reminder of what actually matters to you when the unlimited future stops feeling unlimited. That practice, sustained over months and years, gradually reshapes the choices you make toward the life you most genuinely want to be living. The vault closing. What Robert Greene has built with the laws of human nature is one of the most ambitious and most honest attempts in modern literature to give human beings a clear mirror in which to see themselves and others without the distortions of wishful thinking, social conditioning, or the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about why people do what they do. This is not a comfortable book. It is a clarifying one. And the person who reads it with genuine openness, who is willing to apply its insights to themselves before applying them to others, will emerge with a quality of self-knowledge that genuinely changes how they navigate the most important relationships and decisions of their life. Here is your one specific action for the next 7 days. Choose one person in your life whose behavior has consistently confused or frustrated you, someone whose actions seem to contradict what they say or what you expected of them. Spend 10 minutes this week observing them through the lens of one specific law from this book. What emotion might be driving their behavior beneath the surface? What self-interest might be shaping the reasoning they present as principle? What need for status, security, or approval might explain what logic alone cannot? That single shift in perspective will teach you more about human nature than months of casual observation. The book vault exists to bring you the kind of deep, unflinching intelligence that changes not just how you think, but how you see, how you navigate, and how you build a life that is genuinely informed by the way human beings actually work, rather than the way you wish they did. If this analysis gave you even one insight that changes how you understand yourself or someone around you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Book Vault, and drop your biggest takeaway in the comments below. Share this with someone who is ready to see past the surface of human behavior. The vault is always open for those serious about understanding what is actually happening beneath the story.